Okay, so this series of videos, we're going to look at two things, body organization and homeostasis. Okay, so this is from lecture number 1. So the first thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at the whole idea of how the body is organized, going back a little bit to embryology and understanding how the embryo helps to form adult structures. So we want to remember a couple of things about our embryo. Remember, we're going to roll up into a tube-shaped body with an ectoderm on the outside, and then we're going to have a series of tubes running from dorsal to ventral. That dorsal tube is the dorsal hollow nerve tube. Sorry, dorsal hollow nerve tube. Then we're going to have the notochord, the dorsal aorta, and the gut tube. In this semester, really, I mean, they're all kind of important, but remember the notochord is going to create the intervertebral disc. Then we're going to have the dorsal aorta. The dorsal aorta is going to create the aorta. Then we're going to have the gut tube. Okay. We also want to remember that the gut tube is going to be suspended in a fluid-filled cavity. And that fluid-filled cavity, I'm going to make blue here. This is the fluid-filled cavity that's going to go all around the gut tube, and that's our coelom. This is going to be important when we look at the adult structures on the other side, okay? You also want to remember that the mesoderm, when it splits, when our somatic mesoderm, no, when our lateral plate mesoderm splits, it's going to split into two parts. One part is going to be directly underneath the ectoderm, right? So it's going to be deep to the ectoderm. That's what I'm kind of filling out right there. And the other part is going to be superficial to the gut tube. So the part that is going to line the body wall, this is going to be the somatic mesoderm. And the somatic mesoderm is going to give rise to like blood vessels, and then tissues that actually are going to be part of the body wall. One of the tissues here, that it's going to give rise to is the parietal serosa layer. Then we're going to have the other layer here, which is going to be, remember, our splanchnic mesoderm. Too close to the bottom where all these controls are. And the splanchnic mesoderm gives rise to the visceral serosa. Okay, the serosa is just a back-to-back layer of epithelial tissue that essentially is going to be closer to the body wall or covering the organ, and is going to be what creates the coelomic cavity here, okay? The serosa is going to get a special name for each cavity that it lines, each cavity that it's associated with. And then we're going to remember, you know, we have a dorsal mesentery and we have a ventral mesentery. These mesenteries are only going to be seen in the abdominal cavity, okay? So we want to go back through and understand how our embryo becomes our adult structures. We want to recall that our dorsal hollow nerve tube is basically going to create this dorsal cavity here. So the dorsal body cavity, remember, includes the brain and the spinal cord. That makes sense, right? Because dorsal hollow nerve tube makes up central nervous system, and that includes the brain and the spinal cord. Here we have meninges surrounding everything. The ventral body cavity, so this is going to be our ventral body cavity, and again, this is our ventral body cavity. In our adult. So that ventral cavity has to be created by something in the embryo. It just so happens that it is the coelom. So this coelomic space, this fluid-filled space, creates all these cavities that are in the ventral side of our body. And they're all going to be lined with serosa or serous membrane. Serosa and serous membrane, I mean, you can kind of like use those interchangeably. So that's going to be made out of epithelial tissue. And you see how our coelom has two layers, so our body cavities also have to have these two layers. So the superficial layer, basically the layer that's going to be above the diaphragm or superior to the diaphragm, you're going to see that the bigger cavity, the overall bigger component, is called the thoracic cavity. Okay, so the membranes in the thoracic cavity vary because actually the thoracic cavity is going to be further subdivided into kind of four main areas, really two main areas that then further get subdivided. So one, you're going to have pleural cavities, which are going to surround the lungs. And then the middle portion here, this is the mediastinum. Because it goes between the pleural cavities. It's in the middle part, and then it's going to be posterior to the sternum. Okay, the mediastinum is going to have multiple parts. It's going to have a superior part and an inferior part, and then the inferior part has an anterior, middle, and a posterior part. But for now, let's just understand that that whole part, and maybe I'll make it a dark blue. Let's make it a dark blue. That whole dark blue part is the mediastinum. This green portion, this inferior part, is the pericardial cavity. Okay, so since these are part of the coelom or were formed from the coelom, they're each going to have their own serous membrane, one covering the body wall and one lining the body wall, one covering the organ. So you should see here that like there's a two-layer system. One layer goes this way, and the other layer goes like that way, like that. So we're going to have a parietal pleura, and we're going to have a visceral pleura. And those are the things that surround the lungs. And then between them, that is the remnant of the coelom, which is what we call the cavity or the pleural cavity. Okay. The pericardial cavity also has those two layers. It's going to be more complicated though, but it has a parietal pericardium and it has a visceral pericardium. So again, one layer is towards the body wall, and the other layer is going to be just over the organ. Then inferior to the diaphragm, this whole large area here is called abdominopelvic. Cavity. Sorry about my crazy lines here. The abdominal pelvic cavity is made up of two main areas. One is abdominal, or the abdominal cavity. The abdominal cavity is where you find your gut tube, where you find most of your digestive system and some of your urinary system. And that's going to have a parietal peritoneum and a visceral peritoneum. The parietal peritoneum is going to be next to the body wall. The visceral peritoneum is going to be next to the organs. So that's going to look like this. Parietal peritoneum is going to be right up against the body wall, the front and the back body wall. And then the visceral peritoneum is going to cover our organs, kind of like that. So the layer, so the part that's between is going to be the remnant of the coelomic space, which is what we call the abdominal cavity. Now, the pelvic cavity is not actually really separated by anything physically. And I say that because there's not a bone, there's not a muscle that actually separates the abdominal from the pelvic cavity. But what you kind of see is that the parietal peritoneum is only going to be in the abdominal cavity lining our body wall. And then our pelvic cavity doesn't have that. So everything inside of the pelvic cavity is pretty much retroperitoneal, which means it's back behind the parietal peritoneum. Okay. That includes the bladder and the rectum, and even for women, the uterus. So if you're not quite sure what this retroperitoneal thing means, is you see how the parietal peritoneum is making up the body wall. So anything that's formed here back behind the body wall, back behind the parietal peritoneum, is called retroperitoneal, because it's behind the parietal peritoneum. Sometimes things are retroperitoneal, but they are in the anterior part of the body, like the bladder, meaning the bladder kind of sits right here, and it's actually still back behind the parietal peritoneum, so it's still considered retroperitoneal. Whereas like the rectum, let me get rid of this here so you understand. Whereas the rectum comes like this way, is still back behind the parietal peritoneum, is going to be retroperitoneal. Okay. This is like an overview of the body cavities and the membranes for you. Hopefully I covered everything that I needed to cover. And if you guys have questions, just make sure you come to my office hours and ask.